The town of Bitter Creek sat exposed on the high plains of Wyoming territory like a bone left to bleach in the sun. It was a hard, unforgiving collection of timber and grit, wedged between the rolling sagebrush ocean and the distant, saw-toothed spine of the Bighorn Mountains. In summer, the heat shimmered off the hard-packed dirt of Main Street until the air itself seemed to sweat. But by late October, the wind shifted. It came down from the peaks carrying the scent of pine resin and impending deep freezes, rattling the loose boards of the livery stable and whistling through the gaps in the church steeple. It was 1887, and the air already tasted of snow. The town consisted of a single main artery, rutted by wagon wheels and hardened by frost. A false-fronted general store stood opposite a weather-beaten saloon that smelled perpetually of stale beer and sawdust. Further down, the bank sat squat and brick-faced, looking like a tomb, while the white-clapboard church tried to maintain a dignity that the dusty street did not possess. To the north, the sky was bruising, turning the color of an old iron skillet. The old-timers spat tobacco juice into the dust and watched the horizon, muttering that winter was coming early, and it was coming with teeth. Emma Hale sat by the window of the tiny room she rented above the dressmaker's shop, trying to catch the last gray light of the afternoon. Her fingers were stained with black ink, a permanent mark of her trade, when she wasn't hemming trousers or turning collars for the miners and ranch hands. She wrote letters for those who couldn't hold a pen or spell their own names. She was 28 years old, an age the town matrons whispered about behind their gloved hands as if it were a terminal illness. Emma was not beautiful in the way the saloon girls were, painted and bright, nor soft like the banker's wife. She was tall and slender, with hair the color of roasted coffee beans that she pulled back severely to keep it out of her eyes while she sewed. Her face was pale, her expression often guarded, but her eyes were a striking, clear hazel that seemed to see too much. The children of Bitter Creek liked her. They brought her torn pockets and loose buttons, and she fixed them for a penny or a sweet, listening to their chatter with a patience most adults had lost. But the adults saw her differently. To them, she was the old maid of Bitter Creek, a cautionary tale wrapped in gray wool. It hadn't always been this way. 5 years ago, Emma had walked with a lighter step. She had worn ribbons in her hair and had been promised to Thomas Wade, a young man with a laugh that could fill a room. Thomas had worked the silver mines up in the hills, saving every dollar for a plot of land where they would build a house. But the mines were jealous gods. A shoring timber had snapped deep underground one Tuesday morning, and the mountain had swallowed Thomas and 6 others whole. Emma had grieved with a quiet, devastating dignity. She had put away her wedding dress, stitched it by her own hand, and gone back to work. But grief makes a woman vulnerable, and vulnerability attracts wolves. 6 months after Thomas died, Caleb Moore had come calling. Caleb was the nephew of the sheriff, a man who walked with the swagger of someone who knows the law looks the other way for his kin. He was handsome in a heavy, fleshy way, and his family owned the largest spread in the valley. He didn't ask Emma. He told her. He told her she needed a man to look after her, that she was drying up on the vine. When he had tried to force a kiss on her porch one evening, pressing her back against the rough wood railing, Emma hadn't swooned. She had struck him across the face with a piece of firewood she'd been carrying, cutting his cheek open. Caleb had touched the blood, staring at her with eyes that turned from lust to pure, cold malice. He didn't strike her back. He did something worse. By the next Sunday, the story circulating through the pews was that Emma had lured him there, that she had thrown herself at him in a desperate fit of loneliness, and when he had honorably declined her advances out of respect for her dead fiancé, she had attacked him in a rage. The town, hungry for scandal and afraid of Caleb's uncle, chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Emma became a pariah. The invitations to Sunday dinners stopped. The polite nods on the street turned to averted gazes. She was branded, proud, unstable, and unmarred. Now, her world had shrunk to this single room and the heavy breathing of her mother. Sarah, who lay in the narrow bed in the corner. Sarah's lungs were failing, a consumption that seemed to eat her from the inside out. The medicine, laudanum for the pain and tinctures for the cough, cost $2 a bottle. And the landlord, Mr. Henderson, had knocked yesterday to remind Emma that the rent was due on the 1st, hinting that he had a cousin looking for a room if she couldn't pay. Emma rubbed her aching eyes and looked out at the street below. A group of riders was coming in from the North Road, their horses kicking up clouds of cold dust. At the head of the group rode a man on a massive black gelding. He sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders broad under a shearling coat. His hat was pulled low, but Emma could see the sharp line of his jaw, covered in a dark stubble. It was Luke Carver. Even from here, Emma felt a prickle of dislike. Luke Carver was a name that tasted like copper pennies in the mouths of the locals. He wasn't from Bitter Creek. He had come from Texas 3 years ago with saddlebags full of money and a reputation for ruthlessness. He had bought the Triple C Ranch when Old Man Carter died, and then he had started expanding. The rumors were as thick as the winter coats on the horses. They said Luke Carver was in league with the railroad. They said he had a heart made of ledger paper. They said he didn't believe in God, only in the price of beef, every time a small rancher failed after a dry summer or a hard winter. Carver was there, checkbook in hand, buying up the deed. Emma watched him dismount in front of the saloon. He didn't slap the dust from his coat or shout greetings like the other men. He handed his reins to a stable boy and said something low that made the boy nod vigorously. Luke Carver walked like he owned the ground beneath his boots, and in Bitter Creek, he mostly did. Down on the street, the atmosphere shifted as Luke pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The warmth hit him, carrying the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. The conversation, a low roar of complaints about the coming weather, dipped noticeably before resuming at a forced volume. Luke ignored the eyes on him. He was 32 years old, tired, and burdened with the kind of wealth that isolated a man more than poverty ever could. He walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey. Neat. At a corner table, Caleb Moore sat with 3 other men. Jeb Higgins, a failed prospector with a face like tanned leather. Silas Miller, who had drunk away his small homestead. And a young, impressionable heavy named Boyd. Caleb watched Luke over the rim of his glass, his eyes narrowing. "Look at him," Caleb muttered, loud enough for his table but not the room. "King of the cattle, here to buy the rest of us out before the snow flies." Luke heard him. He had ears like a coyote. But he didn't turn. He finished his drink and tossed a silver dollar on the bar. He turned to leave, but on his way out, he nearly collided with a young boy carrying a crate of empty bottles to the kitchen. The boy stumbled, the crate tipping. Luke's hand shot out, steadying the crate before a single bottle could smash. The boy, terrified, looked up, expecting a curse. "Easy, son," Luke said, his voice a deep rumble that sounded like gravel shifting in a riverbed. "Heavy load for a small man. Keep your chin up, or you'll never see the horizon." He pressed a 50-cent piece into the boy's free hand, more money than the kid would make in a week, and walked out before the boy could stammer a thank you. Outside, the wind was picking up. Luke crossed the street to the bank. He had business with Mr. Sterling, inside the hushed, dim interior of the bank. Luke sat in the leather chair while Sterling nervously shuffled papers. "The storm is coming. Mr. Carver," Sterling said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill in the room. "A bad one." "I know," Luke said. "My men are moving the herd to the south pasture, but I'm worried about the strays in the high timber. I have a line cabin up near Serpent Ridge. I need to check it." Of course," Sterling nodded. "Now, regarding the Hale property, the old deed that got rolled into the sprawling mortgage of the Miller place." Emma, who had just entered the bank's small lobby to plead for an extension on a small loan for her sewing machine, froze. She stood behind the frosted glass partition, hidden from view. "The Hale parcel?" Luke's voice was dispassionate. "Is that the strip along the creek?" "Yes, Goodwater. The widow and her daughter are living in town now." Destitute, I hear. The land is legally yours. Mr. Carver. Part of the acquisition you made last month. Fine, Luke said. Add it to the survey. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. That land was where her father was buried. It was where she had learned to ride. It was the only thing left of her heritage, even if they had lost the title years ago to debt. And this man, this stranger, talked about it like it was just another line in a ledger. She turned and fled the bank before she could be seen, her heart hammering with a hot, bright anger. 10 minutes later, Emma stood in the general store, counting the coins in her palm. She had enough for a small sack of flour, a pound of dried beans, and a small tin of coffee. Not enough for the sugar her mother liked in her tea. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of cold air announced Luke Carver. He filled the aisle. The store suddenly felt smaller. He walked to the counter, nodding to the proprietor. "I need supplies for the line cabin," Luke said. 50 pounds of flour, side of bacon, dried apples, coffee, the good stuff, not the sweepings, and a box of cartridges, 44 caliber. Emma stood nearby, clutching her meager purchases. She looked at the mountain of goods he was ordering without blinking an eye. It was enough food to feed a family for months, and he was buying it for a few days in a cabin. Luke turned, sensing eyes on him. He looked down and saw Emma. He saw the frayed cuffs of her gray wool dress, the ink stains on her fingers, the defiant tilt of her chin. He recognized her from the descriptions he'd heard, the old maid. He thought she looked tired and fiercely proud. "Getting ready for the storm, ma'am?" Luke asked. He meant it as a polite pleasantry, a bridge across the awkward silence. But Emma was still reeling from what she'd heard in the bank. To her ears, his voice dripped with the condescension of a man who had never known a hungry day. "Some of us prepare with what we have. Mr. Carver," she said, her voice sharp as cracked ice. "We don't all have the luxury of buying the store out." Luke blinked, surprised by the venom. He looked at the small sack of low-grade flour in her hands. "I didn't mean offense. If you need—" He gestured vaguely toward the shelves. "I need nothing from you," Emma interrupted, her cheeks flushing. "You've taken enough from this town. I won't have your charity." She slammed her coins on the counter, 3 dimes and 5 pennies, grabbed her goods, and marched out into the wind. Luke watched her go, baffled and strangely stung. "Friendly town," he muttered to the storekeep. "That's Emma Hale," the storekeep said, bagging the flour. "She's got a sharp tongue. That's why she's got no husband. Seems she's got plenty of spine, though," Luke murmured, looking at the door where she had vanished. By evening, the incident at the store had been chewed over, digested, and regurgitated in the saloon until it bore little resemblance to the truth. In the retelling, Emma had cursed Luke Carver to his face and spat on his boots. Caleb Moore sat at his table, nursing a bottle of rye. He listened to the laughter, but he wasn't laughing. He was watching the barometer behind the bar. The pressure was dropping like a stone. "She needs to be taken down a peg," Caleb growled, "walking around like she's a queen in rags. And Carver, he walks around like he owns us all." Jeb Higgins wiped foam from his mustache. "Can't touch Carver. He's got too much money." "Money doesn't keep you warm in a blizzard," Caleb said softly. A dark idea was forming in his mind, fueled by whiskey and hate. "The weatherman says this storm is going to be a killer, a real widowmaker. Carver is heading up to his line shack at Serpent Ridge tomorrow. I heard him say it. So, Caleb leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That shack is miles from nowhere, sturdy, though. Has a heavy door, one way in, one way out." "What are you getting at, Caleb?" "We need to get the girl there," Caleb said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "We put the high and mighty Luke Carver and the saintly Emma Hale in a box together. We lock the door. We leave them there for the storm." "They'll freeze," Boyd said nervously. "No," Caleb said. "That cabin has a stove. There's wood. They won't die. But they'll be trapped, alone, for days, maybe a week. Think about it. When the snow melts and we let them out, her reputation will be gone. Truly gone. She'll be the whore of the county. And Carver? He'll be the man who ruined her. The town will run him out on a rail. He'll be shamed into selling. How do you get her up there? Silas asked. Caleb swirled his drink. She needs money. Desperately. We tell her there's a job. A mercy mission. The plan was hatched in the smoke and shadow. A spider web spun out of spite. The next morning the sky was like a bruise. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees overnight. The wind was already howling, driving grit against the windows. Silas Miller found Luke at the livery stable as he was saddling his horse. "Mr. Carver!" Silas panted, acting out of breath. "Mr. Carver, I was just up near the ridge checking my traps. I saw smoke near your line cabin. And tracks. Cattle tracks heading south." Luke tightened the cinch, his eyes narrowing. "Rustlers?" "Looked like it," Silas lied, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "They were eyeing that winter stock you moved up there. If you ride fast, you can catch them before the storm covers their trail." Luke swore softly. He couldn't afford to lose 30 heads of cattle. "Thanks, Miller," he said, swinging into the saddle. He spurred the black horse, galloping out of town toward the rising slopes. Meanwhile, Caleb Moore knocked on the door of the dressmaker's shop. Emma answered, surprised to see him. She stiffened, her hand going to the doorframe. "What do you want, Caleb?" Caleb took off his hat, feigning humility. "Emma, look, I know there's bad blood." "But this isn't about us. It's the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Gable." "What about her?" "She sent a load of blankets and medicine up to the church shelter, the old cabin on Serpent Ridge, for any travelers caught in the pass. But the boy she sent, he's sick. He dropped the bundle halfway up and came back. She needs someone to run it up there and make sure the cabin is ready. Just lay a fire and leave the blankets." "Why come to me?" Emma asked suspiciously. "Because everyone else is battening down their own hatches," Caleb said, "and Mrs. Gable said she'd pay $10. "Cash." Emma's breath caught. $10. That was 5 bottles of medicine. It was rented for 2 months. That was survival. "It's a long ride," Emma said, looking at the sky. "You take the mule from the livery," Caleb said. "You'll be there and back before the first flake hits. Please, Emma, it's for the church." The mention of the money had already decided it for her. She couldn't let her pride kill her mother. "I'll go," she said. An hour later, Emma was riding a sullen, raw-boned mule out of town, a heavy pack of blankets tied behind her saddle. She wore every piece of clothing she owned: 2 petticoats, a wool dress, a shawl, and a man's heavy coat she had repaired for a customer who never claimed it. The distance to Serpent Ridge was 10 miles. The first 5 were easy, the trail rising gradually through the scrub. But as she hit the timberline, the world changed. The storm didn't arrive. It exploded. One minute the air was gray. The next, it was a wall of white. The wind screamed down the canyon like a banshee, driving snow crystals that felt like ground glass against her skin. The temperature dropped so fast Emma felt the moisture in her nose freeze instantly. "Come on!" she shouted at the mule. Kicking its sides, the animal laid its ears back and trudged forward, head down against the gale. Visibility dropped to the length of the mule's neck. Emma lost all sense of direction. She was guided only by the upward slope of the ground and the desperate hope that the cabin was near. Her fingers inside her mittens were already numb. The cold wasn't just on her skin, it was inside her. A slow, creeping lethargy that made her want to lie down and sleep. Luke was faring a little better. His horse, strong as it was fighting drifts that were already knee-deep. The rustlers, if there were any, would have long since holed up. He realized he had been a fool to ride out. "Damned fool!" he cursed himself, the wind tearing the words away. He knew the line cabin was closed. He knew the landmarks. A split pine, a rock formation shaped like a bear. He saw the pine, a ghost in the swirling white. He pushed the horse forward, the animal struggling. Then, through a break in the driving snow, he saw the dark shape of the cabin logs. He dismounted, leading the horse to the lean-to shed on the side of the structure. He broke the ice on the water trough and threw a blanket over the shivering animal. He stomped to the cabin door, his gloved hand on the latch. He pushed it open and stumbled inside. Out of the wind, the cabin was small, dark, and smelled of pine pitch and old dust. It was a single room, 12 feet by 12, a stone fireplace, a bunk built into the wall, a rough table. Luke shook the snow from his coat and reached for the matchbox on the mantel to light the kerosene lantern hanging from the beam. The door creaked open behind him. Luke spun around, his hand dropping to the Colt on his hip. A figure stumbled in, a bundle of snow-caked wool and ice. The figure tripped and fell to the rough floorboards. "Easy," Luke said. Rushing forward, he grabbed the intruder by the arm and hauled them up. The heavy scarf unwrapped, revealing a face pale as milk, lips blue with cold, and eyes wide with shock. "You," Luke said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Mr. Carver?" Emma's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form the words. What are you doing here?" "This is my cabin," Luke said. "What are you doing here? You'll freeze to death in this—" "The church. Shelter," Emma stammered. "Blankets. $10. Luke looked at her, then at the door where the wind was blowing a drift of snow onto the floor. He realized instantly there was no church shelter. This was the only structure for miles. "There is no church shelter, Emma," Luke said grimly. Before she could process this, the wind roared outside, a sound like a freight train. The storm had turned from a blizzard into a full-blown norther. "We can't go back," Luke shouted over the wind. "Not in this. We have to wait it out." He pulled her deeper into the room and slammed the heavy oak door shut against the gale. He threw the latch. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to the single chair. "I need to get a fire going before we both freeze." Emma sank into the chair, too cold to argue, too confused to fight. She watched him move. Efficient, quick. He smashed a crate for kindling, lit it, and fed it in logs. Soon, flames were licking up the chimney, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Luke found a tin pot and filled it with snow from the drift that had blown in, setting it on the fire to melt. "Drink this when it's hot," he said, not looking at her. He was pacing, his mind racing. Why was she here? Why was he sent here for rustlers that didn't exist? Outside, the wind masked the sound of horses approaching. Caleb Moore and Jeb Higgins had ridden hard, staying just ahead of the worst of the weather, using a lower trail. They tied their horses in the trees, shivering in their heavy coats. They crept up to the cabin. They could see the glow of the fire through the chinks in the logs. They could hear the murmur of voices. "They're in," Caleb whispered, a rictus of a grin on his face. "Both of them." He pulled a hammer and a handful of 6-penny nails from his saddlebag, working quickly, timing their strikes with the gusts of wind that battered the walls. They nailed a heavy 2x4 plank across the door frame. Then another. They drove the nails deep into the seasoned wood. Inside. Luke paused. He tilted his head. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Emma asked, holding her hands to the fire. "Just the wind." Luke frowned. He walked to the door. He lifted the latch and pushed. The door moved an inch, then hit something solid. Luke pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. It didn't budge. It felt like the mountain itself was leaning against it. "The snow?" Emma asked, fear creeping into her voice. "No," Luke said softly. "Snow doesn't hit back." He pounded on the door with his fist. "Hey, is someone out there?" Outside, Caleb and Jeb mounted their horses. They laughed, a sound that was swallowed by the storm. "Sleep tight, lovebirds." Caleb shouted, though the wind carried his voice away toward the valley. They turned their horses and spurred them into the whiteout, racing the death that was coming down from the peaks, leaving the rich man and the old maid locked in the dark, while the snow began to bury the world. Inside, Luke let his forehead rest against the rough wood of the door. He realized, with a sickening clarity, what had happened. The rustlers, the church mission. It was a setup. He turned to look at Emma. She was watching him, her eyes huge in the firelight, the color beginning to return to her cheeks, only to drain away again as she saw his expression. "What is it?" she whispered. "We're locked in," Luke said, his voice flat. Someone nailed the door shut. Emma stood up, her hands trembling. "But why? Who?" Luke looked at the fire, then back at her. "Someone who hates us both." The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound, sealing their fate as the long night began. The dawn did not break so much as it bruised the darkness into a lighter shade of gray. The wind was a living thing, a relentless, howling beast that tore at the corners of the cabin, demanding entry. It slammed against the heavy timber walls, shaking the structure to its foundation, and whistled through unseen cracks with a high, mournful shriek. Emma Hale woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, disoriented by the cold and the strange smell of wood smoke and damp wool, she thought she was back in her mother's room, that the storm was merely rattling the window pane of the boarding house. She shifted, expecting the lumpy straw mattress of her own bed. Instead, her hand brushed against rough-hewn pine logs and the thick, scratchy weave of a strange blanket. Memory rushed back like a bucket of ice water. The ride, the blinding white, the cabin. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. Across the room, the fire had burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing coals. In the dim light, she saw a shape huddled on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in a buffalo coat. Luke Carver. Shame, hot and prickly, flushed her skin despite the freezing air. Emma Hale, the woman who had walked with her head down for years to avoid a single whisper, had spent the night in a remote cabin with a man who was not her husband, a man the town regarded as a predator. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the night, spilling over her shoulders in a tangled mess. She hurriedly tried to smooth it back, her fingers stiff and clumsy with cold. Luke stirred. He groaned low in his throat, the sound of a man waking up in pain, and sat up. He rubbed a hand over his face, the bristles of his beard rasping against his palm. When he looked up and saw Emma watching him, he froze for a split second, then nodded once, a curt, guarded gesture. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough with sleep. "Morning," Emma whispered. Luke stood, stretching his back with a grimace. He was a large man, filling the small space of the cabin, and Emma instinctively pulled her knees to her chest. He seemed to sense her discomfort and deliberately turned his back to her, kneeling to feed kindling into the stove. "Coffee," he muttered. "We need coffee before we figure this out." The domesticity of the offer felt jarring. Emma watched him work the pot and the grounds. He moved with an economy of motion she hadn't expected from a man she assumed had servants to do everything. He didn't look at her hair or her wrinkled dress. He focused entirely on the fire. When the coffee was boiling, black, thick, and bitter, he poured a tin cup and set it on the table, pushing it toward her. "Drink. It'll warm you." Emma took the cup, wrapping her hands around the hot metal. "Thank you." Luke took a sip from his own cup, wincing at the heat. "Storm's worse," he said, nodding toward the door. "Listen to it." "It sounds like it wants to tear the roof off," Emma said. "It might try." Luke said. He set his cup down. "I'm going to check the door. See if the drift has buried us." He walked to the heavy oak door. He lifted the iron latch and put his shoulder to the wood. He pushed. Nothing happened. He frowned, planted his feet, and shoved harder. The veins in his neck corded with effort. The door groaned, but it did not give an inch. It didn't feel like the soft resistance of snow. It felt like it was hitting stone. Luke stepped back, breathing hard. He leaned close to the crack between the door and the jamb. Squinting, "Son of a—" he swore, a harsh, guttural word that made Emma flinch. "What is it?" she asked, standing up. "Is the snow that deep?" Luke turned to face her. His face was dark with a sudden, terrifying anger. "It's not the snow, Emma. It's wood. Someone nailed a board across the frame from the outside. Emma stared at him, the words not making sense. Nailed? But who? Who do you think? Luke snapped, his anger spilling over. Whoever sent me up here for imaginary rustlers. Whoever sent you up here for a charity run that didn't exist. The blood drained from Emma's face so completely she felt lightheaded. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. They locked us in? Trapped us, Luke corrected grimly. Like rats in a box. But why? Emma's voice rose, panic clawing at her throat. Why would anyone do that? To teach me a lesson, I expect, Luke said, pacing the small floor. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. Or to ruin you, or both. Emma sank back onto the edge of the bunk. The implication hit her with the force of a physical blow, locked in, alone, with Luke Carver. For who knew how long. If we are found here, she whispered, her voice trembling. After days, alone. I know, Luke said. He stopped pacing and looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes. Not fear of the cold or starvation, but fear of the eyes of the town. He saw the way her hands shook, spilling a drop of coffee onto her skirt. His anger at the perpetrators remained, a cold, hard knot in his gut. But his irritation with her vanished. She was a pawn in this, just as he was. Emma, he said, his voice dropping, losing its sharp edge. Listen to me. We aren't going to worry about what people say right now. That's a problem for Spring. Right now, we have a bigger problem. What could be bigger than that? She asked miserably. Freezing to death, Luke said bluntly. Or starving. This storm isn't a squall. It's a blizzard. We need to see what we have. He began to rummage through the supplies he had bought. The supplies the town thought were excessive, which might now be the only thing keeping them alive. 50 pounds of flour, he counted, hauling the sack to the corner. Side of bacon, 10 pounds of beans, 5 pounds of dried apples, 2 pounds of coffee, a small sack of sugar. He looked at the wood pile stacked against the wall. Wood is the problem. There's enough here for maybe 3 days of a roaring fire, maybe a week if we burn it stingy. Emma looked at the pile. It looked like a mountain of wood to her, but she knew nothing of high country winters. There are trees outside, she said, and a door we can't open between us and them, Luke reminded her. He looked around the room. It was intimate, too intimate. A single bunk built into the wall with a straw tick mattress, a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace. We have to make a pact, Luke said, standing in the center of the room. If we're going to survive this. Emma wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. What kind of pact? We share the work, Luke said, and we respect space. I'll sleep on the floor. You take the bed. I can't take the bed, Emma protested immediately. You're the one who... This is your cabin. And you're a lady, Luke said firmly. I've slept on harder ground than this floorboards. You take the bed, I'll hang a blanket from the beam if you want privacy. But we need the heat from the fire to reach everywhere. So it might be best to leave it open. Open is fine, Emma said quickly, cheeks pinking again. We ration the food. Luke continued. 2 meals a day, small ones. We don't know how long we'll be here. All right, Emma whispered. The first day passed in a strange, suspended tension. The wind never ceased its screaming. It battered the door, rattling the iron hinges, mocking their captivity. Luke spent hours inspecting the walls, stuffing rags and bits of old rope into the chinks where icy drafts hissed through. He worked silently, his face set in a brooding mask. Emma took over the small stove area. She organized the supplies, placing the tins in neat rows. She washed the few dishes with melted snow water, her hands turning red in the icy liquid. They moved around each other like 2 repelling magnets. If Luke moved to the table, Emma moved to the hearth. If Emma went to the window to scrape away the frost and peer into the white nothingness, Luke stayed by the woodpile. Night fell early, or rather, the gray light simply faded into black. Luke laid his buffalo coat on the floorboards near the hearth. Get some sleep, he said, his back to her. Emma lay down on the bunk fully clothed. She pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin. She stared at the ceiling beams, listening to Luke's breathing slowly and deepening. She didn't sleep for hours. Every creak of the cabin made her jump. She imagined Caleb Moore laughing in the darkness. She imagined her mother coughing, reaching for water that wasn't there. Tears, hot and silent, slid into her hair. The storm did not break the next day, or the next. By the third day, the cabin felt like it had shrunk. The air was stale, thick with the smell of burning pine and frying bacon. The cold was a constant, lurking presence. Even with the fire, the corners of the room were freezing. The water in the bucket skimmed over with ice if they left it too long away from the hearth. Small irritations began to fray their polite veneer. Emma watched Luke toss a handful of coffee grounds into the pot. "You're using too much," she said. It was the third time she had mentioned it. Luke slammed the pot down on the stove. The noise made Emma jump. "It's coffee, Emma, not gold dust. It might as well be," she snapped, her nerves raw. "If we run out, we have nothing warm to drink. You just throw it in there like there's a store next door. But that's how you are, isn't it? You think everything is endless?" Luke turned on her, his eyes flashing. "And you think everything is a tragedy waiting to happen? You hoard everything like a miser. A little pleasure, a strong cup of coffee, might keep us from going mad here. But I suppose you'd prefer we drink hot water and feel righteous about it." "I prefer we survive," Emma cried. "You don't know what it's like to have nothing, to count every grain because you don't know when you'll eat again. You with your bank accounts and your land grabs. Don't speak to me about what I know," Luke growled, stepping closer. "You listen to every whisper in that town like it's the gospel. You think because I have money now, I've never been hungry? You think I don't know what it is to be cold?" He stopped, seeing the genuine hurt in her eyes, and breathed out a long, frustrated sigh. He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm sorry. I hate being caged." He turned away and grabbed the axe, attacking a log from the woodpile with a ferocity that made chips of pine fly across the room. Later that night, the wind shifted, coming from the north with a new, terrible intensity. The temperature inside the cabin dropped until they could see their breath in the firelight. Luke added a precious extra log to the fire. He sat on the floor, whittling a piece of kindling, his movements jerky. "My father," he said suddenly. The silence had been stretching for hours. Emma looked up from her mending. She was trying to stitch a tear in her shawl, but her fingers were stiff. "What?" "My father," Luke repeated, not looking at her. "He was a hard man, old Texas stock. He believed a man wasn't made until he'd been broken." He sliced a long curl of wood. "When I was 14, he sent me out to a line shack, alone, for the winter, said I needed to learn the herd. He gave me a sack of beans and a side of beef and left me—" Emma lowered her needle. 14? That's just a boy." "He didn't think so," Luke said. "I spent 4 months talking to the walls. I ran out of flour in February. I ate nothing but beef and snow for 3 weeks. I swore then I'd never be trapped anywhere again. I swore I'd never be at the mercy of the weather or another man's charity." He looked up at her then, his eyes dark with the memory. "That's why I bought the land, Emma. That's why I have the money. Not to be better than anyone. Just to be safe. To never be that boy in the shack again." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw not the arrogant cattle baron, but the shadow of a lonely, frightened boy behind his eyes. "I didn't know," she said softly. "No," Luke said. "You didn't ask. You just assumed." He went back to his whittling. Emma tried to write in the small diary she carried in her pocket, wanting to record this, but the ink in the small bottle had frozen solid. She stared at the blank page, her hand trembling not just from cold, but from the realization that her judgment had been as harsh as the winter wind. On the 5th morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was deafening. Luke was at the door instantly. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "The storm's broke," he said. "I'm going to try the door." He jammed the flat edge of the poker into the crack between the door and the frame. He braced his foot against the wall and heaved. The wood groaned. "Come on," he grunted, sweat popping on his forehead despite the cold. With a screech of tearing metal, the nails holding the board gave way slightly. The door cracked open 3 inches, but instead of sunlight, a wall of white pressed in. Hard-packed, wind-driven snow, solid as concrete. Luke shoved against it. It didn't move. He dug at it with his hands, clawing out handfuls of ice, but as fast as he dug, more snow crumbled down from above to fill the gap. He pulled back, panting, and looked through the crack. The drift went up past the lintel. They were buried. "It's no good," he said, his voice hollow. "The drift is 10 feet deep if it's an inch, and looking at the sky..." He peered through the narrow gap. "There are more clouds banking up. Dark ones." He let the door slam shut and latched it. Emma was standing by the table, her hands covering her mouth. When the door slammed, she made a small, broken sound. "We're not getting out," she whispered. "Not today," Luke said. "Maybe if we're not getting out," she cried, her voice cracking. She sank onto the bench, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders began to shake. It wasn't a gentle weeping. It was the jagged, tearing sobs of a woman who had held herself together with iron will for too long, only to have the iron snap. Luke stood frozen for a moment. He had seen men cry from pain, but he had never seen a woman cry from this kind of despair. He crossed the room slowly. He hesitated, then awkwardly placed a hand on her shoulder. "Emma," he said gently. "We have food. We have wood. We'll make it." "It's not that," she sobbed into her hands. "Don't you see? It's over. My life is over." "What are you talking about?" She looked up, her face blotchy and tear-streaked, her eyes wild. "The town, Caleb. They know we're here. Every day we stay in this cabin. Every night. They are laughing. They are writing the story. When I walk back into that town, I won't be Emma Hale, the seamstress. I'll be Emma Hale, the... She couldn't say the word. "I fought so hard," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "After Thomas died, after Caleb tried to... I kept my head up. I worked until my fingers bled. I took care of my mother. I was respectable. It was all I had left. And now..." She gestured helplessly at the shared space, the bed, the intimacy of their confinement. "Now I'm just a joke. A dirty joke." Luke felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly doubled him over. He was the reason she was here. His wealth, his pride, his feud with the locals. She was collateral damage in a war she hadn't chosen. He knelt down in front of her, ignoring the hard floor. He took her hands, pulling them away from her face. Her fingers were ice cold. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was soft, but it had steel in it. She met his gaze, her eyes swimming with tears. "This is not your fault," Luke said, spacing the words out. "You hear me? None of this. You came here to help a sick child. You did a good thing, a brave thing." "They won't see it that way," she sniffled. "Then they are blind," Luke said fiercely. "And I will make them see. I promise you. Emma, I won't let them destroy you." He rubbed her cold hands between his large, warm ones. Tell me what happened before, with Caleb. You said they didn't like that you said no." Emma looked down at their joined hands. His thumbs were rubbing the back of her knuckles in a slow, soothing rhythm. It was the first time anyone had touched her with tenderness in 5 years. He came to the house," she whispered. "After Thomas died, he said I needed a man. He grabbed me. I hit him. I cut his face." She took a shuddering breath. "He told everyone I lured him there, that I was crazy with grief and threw myself at him. And because I wouldn't marry him to fix the lie, they believed him, or they pretended to. It was easier to believe the poor widow was crazy than to believe the sheriff's nephew was a beast." Luke's hands tightened on hers, not in anger at her, but in a reflex of protection. A dark, dangerous look passed over his face, then cleared. "He's a coward," Luke said, "and a liar, and when we get out of here, he's going to answer for it." He stayed there, kneeling, holding her hands until her sobbing quieted to ragged breaths. You're not alone in this. Emma, he said. Not anymore. The dynamic in the cabin shifted after that. The wall of ice between them had melted, replaced by a fragile, tentative truce. They fell into a routine that was almost domestic. Luke chopped wood, bringing it in and stacking it with precision. Emma cooked, making biscuits from the flour and frying the bacon, carefully saving the grease. They sat at the table together now to eat, instead of one standing and one sitting. To pass the endless gray hours, they read aloud. Luke found an old, water-stained Bible on a shelf, and a tattered edition of a cattleman's almanac. Emma read from the Bible, her voice clear and steady, reading the Psalms while the wind battered the logs. Luke read the almanac, making dry comments about the price of grain in Chicago that made Emma smile despite herself. They talked, at first. It was safe subjects, the weather, the horses. But slowly, the circles widened. "Why did you come west?" Emma asked one evening. She was mending a tear in his coat, the needle flashing in the firelight. Luke was cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp and metallic. "I told you, to get away from my father. But you could have gone anywhere. Why here? Why Bitter Creek?" Luke paused, rag in hand. "I liked the emptiness," he admitted. Texas is crowded with ghosts. Here, the land doesn't care who your grandfather was. It only cares if you can ride out the winter." He looked at her. "I wanted to build something that was mine, not handed down, not stolen, just mine." "You have a strange way of showing it," Emma said, but there was no bite in her voice. "Buying up everyone else's failures? I pay fair prices," Luke defended, but gently. "Better than the bank would give them at auction. I thought I was helping, in a way, giving them a way out with dignity." "Dignity," Emma mused. "It's hard to keep dignity when you lose your home." "I'm learning that," Luke said, looking at her. "I'm learning a lot of things." The night came that brought the true cold. It was a stillness so profound it felt like the air itself had frozen into glass. The thermometer nailed to the doorframe outside would have read 30 below zero if they could have seen it. Inside, the frost crept across the floorboards toward the hearth. The fire was roaring, but it wasn't enough. The heat was sucked up the chimney before it could warm the room. Luke was sitting by the fire, wrapped in his coat and a blanket, shivering. Emma was on the bed, piled under every scrap of fabric she could find, but her teeth were chattering with a sound like dice rattling in a cup. Luke watched her. He could see the violent tremors shaking her frame. He knew the signs of hypothermia, lethargy, the confusion that would come next. He fought a war within himself. Propriety, honor, the fear of frightening her. But the cold was a physical enemy, and it was winning. "Emma," he said. His voice sounded loud in the silence. "Yes? This isn't working. The fire isn't throwing enough heat to the bed. I know," she stammered. Luke stood up. He dragged his heavy buffalo coat and his blankets over to the hearth rug, right in front of the flames. "You need to come here," he said. "By the fire." Emma climbed out of bed, clutching her blanket, and moved to the hearth. She sat down, wrapping her arms around her knees. "It's still cold," she whispered. Luke took a breath. "We need to share the heat. Emma, body heat, it's the only way to stop the shivering." Emma stiffened. She looked at him, wide-eyed, in the firelight. He looked vast and dark. I can't," she said. "It's not right. Freezing to death isn't right either," Luke said roughly. "I'm not asking to court you. Emma, I'm asking you to stay alive. We sit back to back, that's all. Just back to back. The blanket's over us both." She hesitated. Her body was aching with cold, her fingers numb. She looked at the fire, then at him. He wasn't leering. He looked worried and tired. "Back to back?" she asked. "In my honor," Luke said, slowly. She nodded. Luke sat down on the rug, crossing his long legs. He held up the heavy buffalo coat and the wool blankets like a tent. Emma turned around and sat down, pressing her back against his. He dropped the blankets over them, tucking the edges in tight to seal out the drafts. The effect was instant. The warmth of his broad back seeped through her dress, a solid, radiating heat that stunned her. She felt the solidness of his spine, the strength of his shoulders. Luke felt her trembling, a vibration that ran right through him. He sat perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid to spook her. She felt small against him, fragile. He had an overwhelming urge to turn around and wrap his arms around her, to crush the cold out of her, but he held his ground. Slowly, the heat built up in the cocoon of blankets. Emma's shivering began to subside. Her breathing hitched, then smoothed out. "Better?" Luke asked quietly. His voice vibrated against her spine. "Yes," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long time. The fire crackled. A log shifted. "Luke, yeah, thank you. Don't mention it." The barrier of their clothes seemed to thin. Emma became acutely aware of the rise and fall of his chest with every breath. She could smell him, wood smoke, tobacco, and a scent that was just man. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it made her feel a strange, terrified fluttering in her stomach that had nothing to do with the cold. Luke stared into the fire, his jaw clenched, having her this close, feeling the curve of her spine against his. The warmth of her was torture of a different kind, but it was also right. For the first time in his life, the isolation didn't feel lonely. It felt like a fortress. "Try to sleep," he murmured. "I can't," she said. "Me neither." But eventually, exhaustion won. Emma's head lolled back, resting against Luke's shoulder. Luke stiffened, then slowly relaxed, letting her weight settle against him. Outside, the wind prowled the eaves, looking for a way in. But for tonight, they were safe. Dangerous, terrified, and crossing a line they could never uncross. But safe. November bled into December, and the world outside the cabin ceased to be a landscape and became a prison of white. The snow did not merely fall. It stacked against the hewn logs in great, suffocating drifts, climbing past the window ledge until only the top panes offered a view of the iron-gray sky. The wind scoured the high plains, stripping the warmth from the air. And at night, when the gale died down, the silence was broken only by the snapping of frozen pine boughs and the high, mournful yipping of wolves patrolling the timberline. Inside, the walls seemed to close in. The air grew heavy with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed wool. Luke and Emma moved around each other in a choreographed dance of avoidance and necessity, bound by the smallness of their shelter. The supplies, once seemingly bountiful, began to show the hollow face of scarcity. The sack of flour sat lower in the corner. The side of bacon was whittled down to the rind. Luke became militant about the rations, measuring the beans by the cupful, his face growing leaner, the hollows beneath his cheekbones more pronounced. "We need fresh meat," Luke announced one morning, checking the load in his Winchester. "The flour won't last another month at this rate." Emma looked up from the pot where she was boiling snow water. "It's too cold. Luke, the wind is coming from the north again." "Hunger doesn't care about the wind," he said shortly, pulling his heavy buffalo coat on. "I saw deer tracks near the ridge yesterday. Skinny does, but meat is meat." He left before she could argue further. Emma spent the day pacing the 12 feet of the cabin, pausing every few minutes to scrape a peephole in the frosted glass. The hours dragged. The light began to fail, turning from a bruised purple to the heavy black of a winter night. The wind picked up, screaming down the canyon. A whiteout was forming, a blinding curtain of blowing snow that erased the difference between earth and sky. Luke did not return. Fear, cold and sharp, took root in Emma's chest. She imagined him fallen in a ravine, his leg broken, the snow covering him while he froze. She imagined the wolves she heard at night finding him first. By the time the clock on the mantel, which Luke kept wound with religious precision, struck 7, Emma was standing at the door, her hand on the latch. She pushed it open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "Luke!" she screamed into the void. The sound was torn away instantly. She stood there, shivering violently, eyes streaming from the cold, scanning the swirling white chaos. She would not close the door. She would not let the beacon of the firelight disappear. Minutes stretched into an agony. Then, a shape detached itself from the darkness, a stumbling, hulking shadow. Luke fell through the doorway, crashing to his knees on the floorboards. He was caked in ice, his eyebrows and beard were frozen solid, and he moved with the sluggish clumsiness of the deeply hypothermic. "Oh, God!" Emma cried. She slammed the door against the wind and dropped beside him. "Luke, look at me!" He blinked slowly, his eyes glassy. "Lost the trail," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Turned around, everything white." "You stupid, stubborn fool!" Emma choked out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and relief. She began tearing at the buttons of his coat. His hands were useless, curled into frozen claws in his gloves. She dragged the heavy coat off him, then attacked his gloves. When she pulled them off, his fingers were waxy and white. "Don't put them in the fire," she ordered, though he was already trying to reach toward the flames. "You'll burn them and not feel it. Here." She grabbed a wool cloth, warmed it against her own chest, and wrapped his hands, rubbing them vigorously to bring the blood back. The pain of the thawing circulation made him groan and grit his teeth. "You could have died out there," she scolded, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "For a rabbit? You could have left me here alone with a dead man in the snow." Luke looked at her. He saw the terror in her face, not for herself, but for him. The realization pierced through his fog. She wasn't angry about the meat. She was terrified of the loss. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "I'm sorry. Emma." Later, when the feeling had returned to his extremities and he was sitting close to the fire with a mug of broth, the adrenaline faded, leaving a quiet, raw honesty in the room. "I hate the cold," Luke said softly. Staring into the flames, "It's not just the discomfort. It's quiet. It makes you hear things you don't want to hear." Emma sat on the rug nearby, her skirts tucked around her legs. "What do you hear?" "My own failings," Luke admitted. "My father, he used to say that winter weeded out the weak. He made me watch the herds freeze in the blizzard of '76. Cattle standing upright, frozen solid. He didn't blink. He just calculated the loss. I'm terrified that one day I'll look at a frozen world and feel nothing, just like him." Emma looked at his profile, etched in firelight. "You felt enough to come back," she said. "You felt enough to be afraid. Fear keeps you alive," Luke murmured. He turned to her. "What about you? You carry ghosts, too." Emma picked at a loose thread on her skirt. The near disaster had lowered her defenses. "Thomas," she said, the name tasting like dust in her mouth. "My fiancé." "The miner," Luke recalled. "He was a good man." Emma said, "He wasn't rich. He smelled like black powder and pine sap. We were going to build a cabin in the valley. I had the dress made. I sewed every stitch myself. Tiny pearls on the cuffs. I worked for 6 months to buy those pearls." She stared into the fire, seeing a past that felt a lifetime away. "When the whistle blew at the mine, that long, low blast that means a collapse, I knew. I put on the dress. I don't know why. I sat in the parlor in my wedding dress and waited for them to bring him home." She let out a shaky breath. "He died trying to hold a beam up so 2 other men could crawl out. They lived. He didn't." Luke listened, motionless. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just let her speak. "After that," Emma continued, her voice hardening, "people looked at me differently. Like I was bad luck, like his death was a mark on me. 'Poor Emma,' they said, but they crossed the street when I came near. A widow before I was a wife. Cursed." "You aren't cursed," Luke said, his voice low and firm. "You're just strong enough to survive things that would break other people. There's a difference." Emma looked at him, startled by the conviction in his tone. For a moment, the gap between them, the rich rancher and the seamstress, vanished entirely. They were just 2 survivors warming their hands at the same fire. 4 days later, the weather broke. The sky cleared to a piercing, brilliant blue, though the cold remained vicious. Luke went out to chop wood. the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the canyon walls. When he returned, he carried not just wood, but a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. "Found this wedged in the fence post at the bottom of the trail," he said, tossing it onto the table. "Someone rode by. Didn't try to come up to the cabin, though snow's too deep for a horse without snowshoes." Emma froze. "Mail? Looks like it." She rushed to the table. There were 3 letters. 2 were business correspondence for Luke, bank drafts, cattle counts. 1 was a small, crinkled envelope addressed to Miss Emma Hale in shaky, spiderweb handwriting. Emma's hands trembled as she tore it open. Luke watched her read. He saw the color drain from her face, leaving her as pale as the snow outside. He saw her hand fly to her mouth to stifle a cry. "Emma?" She didn't answer. She read the letter again, then dropped it onto the table as if it burned her. She turned away, walking to the window, her posture rigid. Luke hesitated, then looked at the letter. He didn't want to pry, but her reaction terrified him. "Dear Emma," it read, "I write this in haste. Your mother is taken bad again. The coughing is worse, and she cannot rise from the bed. I have tried to fetch Dr. Evans, but he says he is busy with the mayor's wife and will come when he can. He asked if there was money to pay. And when I said you were away working, he made a sour face. The town is talking. Emma, they say you have run off. I fear for Sarah. She needs medicine and heat. I am doing what I can, but my own wood is low. Pray for us, Mrs. Miller." Luke looked up, his heart sinking. The date on the letter was a week old. "She's alone," Emma whispered, her voice vibrating against the glass pane. "She's dying in that freezing room, and I'm here." "Mrs. Miller is there," Luke offered weakly. "Mrs. Miller is 80 years old." Emma spun around, her eyes blazing with a sudden, ferocious anger. "And the doctor, that coward, he won't go because of me, because of my reputation, because I'm the woman who ran off with Luke Carver." She paced the room, wringing her hands. "I have to go back. I have to walk if I have to." "You can't walk 10 miles in 4 feet of snow," Luke said reasonably. "You'd die before you reach the timberline." "So I just sit here?" Emma screamed. "I sit here and eat your beans and stay warm while she coughs her life away? It's my fault. I left her. I let Caleb trick me because I was so desperate for a few dollars." "It's not your fault you were tricked," Luke said. "It is," she retorted. "I should have known, but we needed the money. We needed it because—" She stopped, a sob catching in her throat. "Because we have nothing. Because the rent is due. Because we lost the ranch." Luke stood very still. The mention of the ranch triggered a memory. A ledger entry he had reviewed in the bank the day they met. Hale Parcell. Foreclosed 1885. Absorbed into Triple C Holdings. He looked at Emma, really seeing the fray on her cuffs, the thinness of her shawl. He thought of his own accounts, overflowing with profit from a boom year. The guilt that had been a low hum in the back of his mind roared to life. "Emma," he said quietly, "the Hale Ranch, it was south of the creek." "Yes," she said bitterly. "The best water in the valley. My father died working that land, and the bank took it 2 years later." "The bank called the note," Luke said, feeling like he was confessing to a murder. "Because I bought the debt." The room went silent. The fire popped, a loud crack in the stillness. Emma looked at him, her brow furrowing. "What?" "My father," Luke began, the words tasting like ash. "He built the Carver fortune by swallowing small homesteads. He'd wait for a bad year, buy the notes from the bank for pennies on the dollar, and then foreclose. He used the law like a weapon. He took a step toward her. When I took over, I told myself I was stopping the cruelty. I stopped the evictions in winter. I offered fair prices. But I didn't stop buying. I kept expanding." He looked her in the eye. "I own the mortgage on the Miller place and the Hale place. I bought the portfolio 3 years ago. I didn't know who you were. Emma? It was just a name on a piece of paper, but I profited from the loss of your home, the money that sits in my bank account. Some of it came from the land your father died for." Emma stared at him. Her expression shifted from confusion to shock, and then to a cold, hard realization.
You,
she whispered.
I didn't know it was you.
Luke pleaded. If I had known. You didn't know. Emma's voice rose to a shout. You didn't care. We were just numbers to you. My mother cried for weeks when we had to leave that house. She aged 10 years in a day. And you were sitting in your big house, counting your cattle on our grass. She grabbed the tin cup from the table and hurled it at him. It struck his shoulder and clattered to the floor. But Luke didn't flinch. You stand there, she hissed, acting the hero, feeding me, protecting me. But you're the reason I'm here. If we hadn't lost the land, I wouldn't be destitute. I wouldn't have needed Caleb's $10. I wouldn't be locked in this cabin with you. Emma, please, don't speak to me, she screamed. She turned and threw the bolt on the door. Emma, don't go out there, Luke shouted. Lunging forward, she ignored him, shoving the door open and stumbling out into the snow. The cold hit her instantly, biting through her dress, but her rage was hotter. She waded into the drift, gasping, just wanting to be away from him, away from the suffocating reality of his guilt. Luke was right behind her. He didn't grab her coat, he grabbed her arm, spinning her around. The snow was up to their thighs. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Let me go, she shrieked, struggling against his grip. Get back inside, Luke roared over the wind. You'll freeze in 5 minutes. I'd rather freeze than look at you, she yelled back. You built your life on broken backs. Luke Carver, you stand on top of us and tell us to be grateful for the view. I can't undo the past, Luke shouted, his own temper snapping. I can't give back the years, but I am trying to do better. I am not my father. This winter, this cabin, it's changed me. Emma, you changed me. I don't want to change you, Emma cried. She tried to shove him away, but her boot slipped on a patch of hidden ice beneath the powder. Her feet went out from under her. She fell backward. Luke reacted on instinct. He lunged, catching her around the waist before she hit the hard-packed ice. His momentum carried them both against the rough logs of the cabin wall. Suddenly, they were motionless. Luke was pinning her against the wall to keep her upright. His arm locked around her waist. His other hand braced against the logs by her head. Their faces were inches apart. Emma was panting, her breath coming in white clouds that mingled with his. She stared up at him, her eyes wide, the anger still burning but suddenly mixed with something else, something sharp and terrifying. Luke looked down at her. He saw the snowflakes caught in her eyelashes. He saw the flush of rage and cold on her cheeks. He felt the rapid thud of her heart against his chest. The urge to kiss her, to bridge the gap between them with something other than words, hit him with the force of a landslide. For a long, suspended second, the wind seemed to stop. The anger evaporated, replaced by a raw, electric tension that made the air crackle. Luke's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. Emma felt it too. The pull, the sudden, overwhelming awareness of his strength, his heat. It terrified her more than the cold. She was vulnerable, ruined, and furious, and yet she wanted to lean into him. The thought panicked her. She wrenched herself free, pushing hard against his chest. No, she gasped. She scrambled back through the open door. Stumbling into the cabin, she slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. Luke stood outside in the snow for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, staring at the wood grain of the door. He cursed himself, long and low. That night, the cabin was a tomb of silence. They did not speak. Emma lay on the bed, facing the wall. Luke sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood until there was nothing left but shavings. The next morning, Emma did not wake up. When Luke called her name, she moaned. He went to the bunk and touched her shoulder. She was burning up. Emma, she thrashed under the blankets. Cold, she muttered. So cold. Her teeth chattered, but her skin was dry and hot to the touch. The stress, the malnutrition, and the exposure to the biting cold during their fight had finally overwhelmed her constitution. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Luke. He had seen this before, pneumonia or brain fever. It killed quickly in the high country. "Not you," he whispered fiercely.
I won't lose you too.
The next 3 days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. Luke ceased to be a cattleman. He became a nurse. He melted snow and tore up one of his own clean shirts to make cool compresses for her forehead. He made a thin broth from the last of the dried meat and spooned it into her mouth, coaxing her to swallow. He sat by the bed, massaging her hands and feet to keep the blood moving, murmuring to her constantly to keep her tethered to the world.
Stay with me, Emma. Spring is coming. The flowers will be out. You have to see the flowers.
On the second night, the fever spiked. Emma began to toss wildly, caught in a delirium. "No," she whimpered, throwing her arm up as if to block a blow. "Please, stop." Luke caught her hand gently. "Shh, Emma, you're safe. It's Luke." "No, Caleb," she cried out, her voice high and terrified. "Get off! I said no!" Luke froze. "Don't touch me!" Emma screamed, thrashing. "I don't want to! Stop!" She made a shoving motion, then curled into a ball. "He's lying," she sobbed into the pillow. I didn't ask him to." Luke sat back, his hand still holding hers, but his blood had turned to ice. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The unwanted advance the town whispered about wasn't a clumsy pass. It was an assault. Caleb Moore had tried to rape her, and when she fought him off, when she cut his face, he had destroyed her life to cover his crime. A rage, darker and deeper than anything Luke had ever felt, rose up in him. It wasn't the hot flash of temper. It was the cold, calculating fury of a man who has found his target. He looked at Emma, small and broken in the bed, fighting ghosts. "I swear to you," Luke whispered into the dark room, his voice shaking with the intensity of his vow. "If we get out of here, he will pay. He will lose everything. I will burn his world to the ground for this." He squeezed her hand.
Rest now. I've got you. No one hurts you while I breathe.
By the fourth morning, the fever broke. Emma woke to a feeling of profound weakness, as if her bones had turned to water. The room was dim. The fire was low. She turned her head. Luke was sitting in the chair beside the bed, slumped forward, his head resting on his arms on the edge of the mattress. He was asleep. She looked at him. His shirt was stained with soot and broth. His beard was heavy and unkempt. There were dark purple bruises of exhaustion under his eyes. His hands, those large, capable hands, were resting near hers, red and chapped from handling wet cloths and snow. She remembered, in fragments, the last few days, the coolness on her head, the voice in the dark, the feeling of being held when the shaking was too bad. He had kept her alive. He, the man she had screamed at, the man whose business had ruined her family, had fought for her life while she was helpless. She reached out, her hand trembling, and lightly touched his hair. Luke jerked awake instantly. He sat up, blinking, his eyes immediately finding hers. "Emma, I'm here," she whispered. Her voice was a croak. Luke let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He reached out and touched her forehead. It was cool and damp. "The fever's gone," he said, his voice thick with relief. "Thank God." Emma looked at him, tears filling her eyes. "You stayed. Where else would I go?" Luke tried to smile, but it was weak. "You took care of me," she said. "After everything I said." "You spoke the truth," Luke said quietly. "I needed to hear it." He poured a cup of water and held it to her lips. She drank greedily. "Thank you," she said, handing the cup back. "Luke, thank you." Their eyes met. The anger of the argument was gone. The polite distance of the early days was gone. In its place was something forged in the fire of survival and the intimacy of the sickbed. There was gratitude, yes, and guilt, but underneath it was a warmth that frightened them both with its intensity. "Get some sleep," Luke said, his voice gentle. "We made it through the night." "We made it," Emma echoed, closing her eyes. The barrier between them had thinned to almost nothing, and outside, the snow finally stopped falling. The fever retreated slowly, withdrawing like a tide that had scoured the shore clean, leaving Emma weak but lucid. For the first time in a week, she stood on her own 2 feet in the center of the cabin, the floorboards cold beneath her wool stockings. The room spun lazily, tilting on its axis, but she reached out and gripped the back of the chair, steadying herself. Luke was there in an instant. He didn't grab her, but his hands hovered inches from her elbows, a protective cage ready to snap shut if she fell. "Easy," he murmured. "You've been flat on your back for days. The blood hasn't figured out which way is up yet." "I'm fine," Emma said, though her voice lacked its usual steel. She looked at him, really looked at him. He had shaved the worst of his beard with a knife and cold water, leaving his jaw clean but red-scraped. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the firelight and worry, but his gaze was clear. "I can't stay in that bed forever. Luke, I'll rot." "I wouldn't let you rot," he said, dropping his hands but not stepping back. "I'd turn you every hour like a roasting spit." Emma laughed, a rusty, surprising sound that seemed to startle the silence of the room. "You have a terrible bedside manner, Mr. Carver. I'm a cattleman. Miss Hale, my patients usually have horns." The lightness between them was new, fragile as new ice, but it held. Over the next week, as Emma's strength returned, the cabin ceased to feel like a prison cell and began to feel, strangely, like a home. The boundaries of their confinement were defined by the 4 walls, but within them, a quiet, companionable rhythm took hold. Luke taught her how to survive. One afternoon, when the wind was low, he brought a length of copper wire and a stout branch to the table. "If the flour runs out," he said, "we need to be able to catch meat without wasting bullets. A gunshot scares everything for 5 miles. A snare just waits." He showed her how to twist the wire, how to create the loop that would tighten with struggle. Emma's fingers, dexterous from years of needlework, mastered the knot faster than he expected. "Like this?" she asked, holding up the deadly little loop. Luke nodded, impressed. "Exactly like that. You have good hands." "I have nimble hands," she corrected. "There is a difference." Later that evening, Emma insisted on repaying the lesson. She took Luke's heavy flannel shirt, the one he had torn on a nail by the doorframe, and sat by the fire. "Take it off," she instructed. "I can't mend it while you're wearing it." Luke hesitated, then unbuttoned the shirt, stripping down to his long-handled undershirt. He felt exposed, not because of the cold, but because of the way she looked at the fabric with such professional intensity. He sat opposite her, watching. She didn't just sew, she engineered. Her needle dipped and wove, closing the jagged tear with stitches so tiny they were almost invisible. "You sew like you're angry at the cloth," Luke observed softly. "I sew like I want it to hold," Emma murmured, not looking up. "My father used to say a seam is only as good as the patience of the tailor. If you rush, the wind gets in." "You don't rush," Luke said. "No," she said, biting the thread. She handed the shirt back to him. "I endure." The landscape outside shifted subtly. The storms grew less frequent, the violent rages of wind replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. The temperature remained brutally low, freezing the breath in their lungs the moment they stepped outside for wood. But the sky was often a piercing, relentless blue. At night, the coyotes sang. Their yips and howls echoed off the canyon walls, sounding like the laughter of madmen. In the vast, white silence, Luke and Emma felt a profound isolation, as if the rest of the world, Bitter Creek, the bank, the gossip, the debts, had simply ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the woodpile, and each other. One evening, the dynamic in the room shifted. Usually, they sat at opposite ends of the small table, or with Luke on the floor and Emma in the chair. But tonight, the draft from the door was particularly biting. Luke moved his chair closer to the hearth. Emma, shivering slightly despite her shawl, moved hers to join him. They sat side by side, the firelight playing across their faces. The silence wasn't heavy. It was companionable, filled with the popping of sap in the pine logs. "When you first rode into town," Emma said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was contemplative, not accusing. "I saw you from my window. You were on that big black horse. You looked untouchable." Luke chuckled darkly. "I felt tired and saddle sore."
"I thought you were just another king arriving to inspect his kingdom,"
Emma admitted. "I thought you believed you could buy anything you wanted. Land, cattle, respect." Luke turned the tin cup in his hands, staring at the dark coffee. "I used to think that," he confessed. "Or at least, I hoped for it. My father taught me that respect was something you forced out of people, like water from a pump. If you owned the ground they stood on, they had to tip their hats." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "I was wrong. You can buy fear. You can buy obedience. But respect, that's harder." "The town respects you," Emma said. "The town fears my bank account," Luke corrected. "And they despise me for it. I saw how they looked at you. Emma, that first day in the store, I saw a woman standing alone against a town that wanted to crush her. I thought you were cold. I thought you were judgmental." He paused, shifting in his chair so his knee brushed the fabric of her skirt. "I didn't see that you were just trying to keep from being broken. You're braver than any man I've hired. Emma, braver than me. I think." Emma felt a flush rise in her cheeks, hot and sudden. "I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn." "Stubbornness is just bravery that holds its ground," Luke said. The compliment hung in the air between them, thick and sweet. Emma turned to look at him. The lamplight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone and the softness of his mouth. They were suddenly acutely aware of the proximity, the inches between their shoulders, the way the air seemed to charge with electricity where their bodies almost touched. Luke's gaze dropped to her lips, lingering there for a heartbeat too long, before he forced himself to look back at the fire. Emma's breath hitched, a dangerous, terrifying warmth uncurled in her stomach. The moment was shattered by a roar from outside. It hit without warning, a micro-burst of wind that slammed into the cabin like a giant's fist. The heavy timbers groaned under the assault. Dust sifted down from the ceiling beams. The door rattled violently in its frame, the latch jumping. "Get back!" Luke shouted, springing up. Before Emma could move, a tremendous crash shook the entire structure. A dead pine tree, sheared off by the wind, slammed against the side of the cabin near the chimney. The impact was deafening. Emma screamed, a short, sharp sound of pure terror. Instinct took over. She didn't run for the bed. She lunged toward Luke. He caught her, wrapping his arms around her and spinning his body to shield her from the wall that had been struck, in case it gave way. They stood locked together in the center of the room, Luke's back to the danger, Emma's face buried in the rough wool of his shirt. She was trembling violently, her hands clutching the fabric at his waist. Luke held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head, his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But as the wind shrieked and the cabin settled, the fear began to recede, leaving something else in its wake. Luke became aware of the way she fit against him, perfectly, as if she had been carved to stand in the circle of his arms. He could smell the scent of her hair, like rainwater and wood smoke. He could feel the heat of her body seeping through his clothes, warming the places in him that had been cold for years. The wind outside dropped to a moan. The roof held. They did not let go. Emma pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him. Her hands were still flattened against his chest. Her eyes were wide, dark pupils swallowing the iris, filled with a vulnerability that stripped him bare. "It held?" she whispered. "It held," Luke murmured. His voice was rough, deep. He didn't step away. He couldn't. The magnetic pull that had been growing for weeks, fed by shared meals and shared cold and shared survival, was now undeniable. Very slowly, giving her every second to pull away, to slap him, to run. Luke lifted his hand. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. His skin was rough, calloused from work, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut for a second, seeking the warmth. "I won't let anything hurt you," Luke whispered, the promise vibrating through his chest into hers. "Not the storm, not the town, not him. I swear it. Emma." Emma opened her eyes, and they were swimming with tears. "I'm so tired. Luke," she choked out. "I'm so tired of being afraid all the time, of being alone." "You're not alone," he said. He lowered his head. The first kiss was barely a touch, a question asked in the space between heartbeats. Emma made a small, whimpering sound and bridged the gap. It wasn't the kiss of a romance novel. It was the collision of two starving people finding sustenance. It was hesitant at first, tasting of salt and fear, but then it deepened. Decades of loneliness, of Emma's grief for Thomas, of Luke's isolation, poured into it. It was fierce and tender all at once. Luke's other hand came up to cradle the back of her head, holding her as if she were made of glass. Emma's hand slid up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself to him. For a minute, the world was just the heat of their mouths and the desperate cling of their bodies. Then, reality crashed back in. Emma broke away, gasping for air, her eyes wide with sudden panic. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered, horror dawning on her face. "No, we can't. They were right. They'll say The shame of the old Maid label, the fear of being the loose woman they accused her of being, reared its head. Luke stood where she had left him, his hands empty, his expression one of dazed hurt that quickly smoothed into gentle resignation. "Emma," he said, reaching out a hand but not moving toward her. "It wasn't a mistake, but I won't." He dropped his hand. "I will never force you. I will never take more than you want to give. You determine the distance." "I can't," she sobbed, turning away and fleeing to the sanctuary of the bunk. She curled up, facing the wall, pulling the blanket over her head. Luke stood by the fire, his blood singing, his heart aching. He touched his lips, where the ghost of her taste lingered, and turned to stare into the flames. For the next 3 days, they lived in a torturous purgatory. They moved around the small cabin like ghosts, murmuring polite excuses when they bumped into each other. The air was thick with unspoken words. Every time their fingers brushed when passing a plate or a cup, a jolt of electricity went through them both, visible in the way Emma would jerk her hand back or Luke would clench his jaw. They were acutely aware of each other. Luke watched the way the light caught the stray hairs on her neck. Emma watched the muscles in his back as he chopped wood. The desire wasn't gone, it was just dammed up, rising higher with every hour. Then came the night the temperature plunged to 40 below. The cold was a physical weight. It seeped through the chinking, turning the water in the bucket to solid ice within an hour of melting. The firewood supply was critically low. Luke had calculated they had enough for maybe 4 more days if they burned it sparingly. They couldn't afford a roaring blaze all night. Luke banked the fire early, preserving the coals. He laid out his bedroll on the floor, wearing his coat, his hat, and wrapping himself in the buffalo robe. Emma lay on the bunk, piled under quilts, but the cold was insidious. It crept under the blankets, settling in her bones. She lay there for an hour, shivering so hard the bed frame rattled against the wall. She heard Luke shifting on the floor. He wasn't sleeping either. The floor was drafty, the coldest place in the room. She thought of the town. She thought of the whispers. Whore. Fallen woman. Then she thought of Luke's hands, how they had cooled her fever. She thought of his voice promising to protect her. She thought of the kiss, and the way he had looked at her, not with greed, but with reverence. She realized, with sudden clarity, that she didn't care about the town anymore. The town hadn't saved her life. Luke had. "Luke?" Her voice was small in the darkness. Luke went still. "Yeah, it's too cold. I know," he said through gritted teeth. "Try to curl up tight." "No," she said. "I mean, it's too cold for you to be on the floor, and I can't stop shaking." Silence stretched out. "Emma," Luke warned gently.
If I come up there, I know, she whispered. Please, I don't want to be alone. She heard him sit up. He moved in the dark, a large shadow. He came to the edge of the bunk. I'll stay on top of the blankets if you want, he offered, giving her an out. No, Emma said, her heart hammering against her ribs. We'll freeze otherwise. She scooted to the wall, making space on the narrow mattress. Luke sat down and pulled off his boots. He slid under the heavy pile of quilts, fully clothed, lying stiffly on the edge of the bed. The heat radiating from him was like a furnace. Emma let out a sigh of pure relief as the warmth began to cut through the chill. They lay side by side, staring up at the dark beams of the ceiling. They were not touching, save for the brush of their arms. You okay? Luke whispered. Yes, she said. Then, braver. Closer. You're going to fall off. Luke shifted. His arm came around her, hesitant at first, then settling over her waist to pull her against him. Emma turned into him, burying her face in his shoulder. The defenses crumbled. The dam broke. I wanted to be a teacher, Emma whispered into the dark, the confession spilling out. Before Thomas, before everything, I wanted to have a house full of books. I wanted to be an architect, Luke whispered back, his chin resting on her hair. I liked drawing plans, but my father said only soft men draw. Real men build with blood. He was wrong, Emma said fiercely. She ran her hand up his chest, feeling the beat of his heart. You're not him. Luke, you're nothing like him? I feel like him sometimes, Luke admitted. Hard, cold. You're not cold, she said. She lifted her head, finding his face in the shadows. You're the warmest thing I've ever known. She pressed her lips to the pulse point in his neck. Luke groaned. A low, rumbling sound. His arm tightened around her. Emma, are you sure? I'm sure, she said. I don't want to wait for spring. I don't want to wait for permission from people who hate us. She found his mouth. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was hungry, desperate, and claiming. It was the inevitable collision of two souls who had been orbiting each other in the dark. Luke rolled, hovering over her, taking his weight on his elbows so as not to crush her. He looked down at her in the dim light. He touched her face, tracing the line of her cheek, her throat. He treated her like she was made of porcelain, precious and rare. You are so beautiful, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I have wanted you since the moment I saw you fighting me in that store. I wanted you too, Emma admitted, arching up to meet him. Even when I hated you, they came together not with the fumble of youth, but with the deliberate, intense passion of adults who know exactly what they are risking and do not care. The clothes were shed layer by layer, discarded onto the cold floor. Skin against skin was a shock and a revelation. For Emma, it was a rewriting of history. Where Caleb had been violent and entitled, Luke was worshipped. He asked with every touch. He listened to her body. He made her feel cherished, not used. For Luke, it was a grounding. He had spent his life conquering land, trying to fill a void, but holding Emma, being inside her. He felt like he had finally arrived home. She wasn't a conquest. She was a sanctuary, the climax. When it came, was quiet and shattering. A release of tension that left them both clinging to each other, breathless and trembling. Afterward, the silence in the cabin was different. It wasn't empty anymore. Luke pulled the blankets up over them, tucking them around Emma's shoulders. He pulled her back against his chest, spooning her, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. They lay awake, listening to the wind scour the roof. When the snow melts, Luke said into the darkness, his voice steady and deep. We go back, together. Emma tensed slightly. They'll know, just by looking at us. Let them look, Luke said. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. Emma, I'm not riding off to the ranch and leaving you in town. You're with me now. If they want to come for you, they have to come through me. It will be hard, she whispered. The church, the bank. We'll handle it, Luke promised.
He kissed the back of her neck. I've got money. And now I've got a reason to fight that actually matters. Let them try. Emma closed her eyes. For the first time in 5 years, the knot of fear in her chest loosened. She wasn't the old maid. She wasn't the tragic widow. She was Emma. And she was held. I don't regret it, she whispered, half to herself, half to him. Even if they ruin me, I don't regret this. They won't ruin you, Luke said, his hold tightening. We'll build something new, something they can't touch. And as the winter night deepened, wrapping the cabin in its frozen fist, the two people inside slept soundly, warmed by a fire that had nothing to do with the wood in the stove. The Chinook wind arrived in the night, a warm, restless breath from the southwest that ate the snow like a starving wolf. For months, the world had been defined by the brittle silence of the freeze. But now, the air was filled with the sound of weeping. Water dripped from the eaves in a chaotic rhythm. The great drifts that had swallowed the cabin to its windows began to slump and gray, revealing the dark, wet wood beneath. Inside, the change was felt in the bones. The desperate survival mode that had defined Luke and Emma's existence began to lift, replaced by a heavy, suffocating dread of what lay below the timber line. On the morning they decided to leave, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with moisture. Luke packed their meager belongings, the empty flour sack, the coffee tin, the buffalo robe. Emma swept the floor of the cabin, a habit of order she couldn't shake even now. They will talk, Emma said. She was standing by the door, looking at her hands. They were rougher now, chapped from the cold, but strong. You know what they will say. Luke, they won't see us as survivors. They will see sin. Luke cinched the saddle on his horse, his movements sharp and angry. Let them talk. Words are just wind. Emma, words can kill, she replied softly. Or they can starve you, if the town decides I'm a fallen woman. If the church turns its back, then I will stand in front of you, Luke said. He stopped what he was doing and crossed the room, taking her shoulders in his hands. I mean it. I won't let them brand you alone. We walk into that town with our heads up. We have nothing to be ashamed of. I spent 5 years trying to be invisible, she whispered. Now I'm going to be a spectacle. You're going to be the woman who survived the winter, Luke corrected. He went outside to check the pack mule. The snow around the door had melted back significantly, revealing the raw earth and the debris of the storm. Luke kicked at a slurry of mud and ice near the threshold, clearing a path. His boot struck something hard. He looked down. Half buried in the mud were several scraps of lumber, fresh, unweathered pine, and lying next to them, glinting dully in the gray light, were nails. Luke crouched, picking one up. It was a 6-penny nail, square-cut, with a distinctive blue hue to the iron. He knew these nails. He had seen kegs of them at the hardware store in town. A specific shipment from St. Louis that Caleb Moore had bragged about ordering for a barn raising that never happened. Luke shifted the mud with his hands. He found the boot prints, preserved under the deep drift that had formed over them, now exposed by the melt. They were deep, heavy impressions, the heel marks distinct. 2 men, maybe 3. They had stood right here, hammering the boards across the door while the storm howled, sealing 2 people inside to die or be ruined. The rage that ignited in Luke's chest was not the hot flare of a fight. It was the cold, black burn of a coal seam fire. Luke, Emma called from the doorway. What is it? Luke stood up, clutching the nail in his fist until it bit into his palm. He turned to her. It wasn't just a prank. Emma, he said, his voice low and vibrating with danger. And it wasn't an accident. He held up the nail. I know who bought these, and I know who wears a heel like that. Emma stared at the nail, realization dawning slowly, turning her face pale. Caleb, Luke confirmed. He nailed us in. He left us here when the blizzard was hitting. He didn't care if we froze or starved, as long as he broke you. Emma felt a sickness roll over her. She leaned against the doorframe. The cruelty of it, the sheer, focused malice, took her breath away. He hates me that much? she whispered. Just because I said no? He hates that he couldn't own you, Luke said, and he hates that I have what he wants. He walked back to her, his eyes hard. I'm going to make him regret the day he was born. Emma, but I need you to be ready. This isn't going to be a quiet return. Emma looked at the mud, then at the nail in Luke's hand. The fear that had paralyzed her for years, the fear of gossip, of the sheriff, of hunger, suddenly felt small compared to the enormity of this violation. I'm ready, she said, and for the first time, her voice didn't tremble. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare of slush and instability. The warm wind had turned the snowpack into a treacherous, rotting mess. The horses floundered belly-deep in wet, heavy drifts that hid jagged rocks and drop-offs. Luke rode in front, picking a path through the timber. Emma followed on the mule, her knuckles white on the reins. The silence of the high country was gone, replaced by the roar of water. Every ravine was a torrent. Every slope was a potential slide. They reached the crossing at Elk Creek 3 hours later. In summer, it was a lazy stream. Now, fed by the rapid melt, it was a brown, churning violence of ice chunks and timber, swollen 10 feet wide. We have to cross here, Luke shouted over the roar of the water. The lower bridge will be washed out. He urged his black horse into the water. The animal fought the current, slipping on the unseen stones, water swirling up to the saddle fenders. But Luke held him steady, guiding him to the far bank. He scrambled up the mud, the horse heaving. Keep his head up, Luke yelled to Emma. Emma kicked the mule forward. The animal balked, ears pinned, terrified of the noise. Emma slapped the reins, desperate. The mule lunged into the icy brown water. Halfway across, a submerged log struck the mule's front legs. The animal stumbled, pitching forward. Emma screamed as she was thrown from the saddle. She hit the freezing water with a bone-jarring slap. The current grabbed her instantly, dragging her downstream, her heavy wool skirts weighing her down like lead anchors. Emma! Luke didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He vaulted from his horse, hitting the bank running, and dove into the churning water. The cold was a shock that nearly stopped his heart. He thrashed against the current, fighting the debris. He saw Emma's head bob up, her face a mask of terror, before she was pulled under again. Luke lunged, his hand closing around the fabric of her coat. He dug his boots into the muddy creek bed, straining every muscle in his back. He hauled her up, gasping, and dragged her toward the bank. They collapsed in the mud, soaked, freezing, and gasping for air. The mule, having found its footing, was already shaking itself off on the grass. Luke rolled over, grabbing Emma's face. Are you hurt? Did you hit anything? Emma was coughing up water, shaking violently from the shock. I'm cold, she stammered. So cold. We have to keep moving, Luke said, hauling her up. If we stop, we freeze. He lifted her onto his horse, climbing up behind her to share his body heat. They left the mule to follow and rode the last 5 miles in a grim, shivering silence. When the town of Bitter Creek finally came into view, it looked small and gray under the leaden sky. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys. The church spire poked at the clouds like an accusing finger. They rode down Main Street at noon. The reaction was immediate. A woman shaking a rug on her porch froze, mouth agape, before dropping the rug and running inside. Men standing outside the livery stable stopped their conversation, staring openly. The silence that rippled down the street was louder than the creek had been. They looked like ghosts, mud-splattered, soaked, their clothes torn, their faces gaunt from months of rationing. But they were alive. Emma felt the eyes on her. She felt the familiar clawing of shame in her gut, the instinct to hide her face. She could hear the whispers starting, the hiss of judgment jumping from porch to porch. Look at her. Look at the state of her. With him, all winter. She began to shrink in the saddle. Luke felt her retreat. Without a word, he reached around her waist with one arm, holding her steady. Then, he took her hand in his large, bruised hand covering her trembling one. He didn't hide it.
He rested their joined hands on the pommel of the saddle, plain for every soul in Bitter Creek to see. He sat straighter, his jaw set in granite. He looked directly at the men by the livery, daring them to speak. They rode past the saloon, past the general store, and stopped in front of the boarding house where Emma lived. Emma slid down from the horse, her legs wobbling. She rushed to the door, desperate to see her mother, to tell her she was safe, to bring the money she had earned. She burst into the hallway. The landlady, Mrs. Gable, stepped out of the parlor. When she saw Emma, her face went hard and pinched. "Mother," Emma called out, moving toward the stairs. "Is she? She's gone. Emma." "Mrs." Gable said flatly. Emma froze, her foot on the first step. "What?" "She passed 3 weeks ago." "Mrs." Gable said, crossing her arms. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer condolences. She looked embarrassed and angry. "The coughing took her. We buried her on the Tuesday. Three weeks," Emma whispered. The room spun. "But I wasn't." "No, you weren't." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice dripping with judgment. "You were up in the hills, with him, while your mother died alone in that room." "I was trapped," Emma cried, the grief hitting her like a physical blow. "I couldn't get back." "That's not what people are saying," Mrs. Gable sniffed. "And honestly, Emma, very few came to the funeral. It was awkward. Given the circumstances, people felt the family had been shamed enough. The cruelty of it, that the town had punished her dying mother for Emma's absence, shattered her." Emma's knees gave way. She sank to the wooden floor, a wail of pure anguish tearing from her throat. Luke, who had followed her in, stepped past the landlady as if she didn't exist. He dropped to his knees beside Emma, wrapping his arms around her as she rocked back and forth, sobbing. "I wasn't there," she choked out, clutching his wet coat. "I let her die alone. Luke, I let her die alone." "You didn't know," Luke said fiercely, glaring at Mrs. Gable until the woman took a nervous step back. "You did everything to save her. You nearly died trying to earn money for her. Get her out of here," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling but obstinate. "I can't have this display. I have respectable tenants." Luke stood up, pulling Emma with him. He looked at the landlady with eyes so cold she actually shivered. "Respectable." Luke spat the word like a curse. "There isn't a respectable soul in this house. Come on, Emma." He let her out, supporting her weight, leaving Mrs. Gable pale and shaken in the hallway. News traveled faster than the wind. By the time Luke had taken Emma to the hotel, ignoring the clerk's scandalous look and paying for a room so she could wash and rest, the story was fully formed. Caleb Moore was holding court in the saloon. "I told you," Caleb was saying, slamming a beer onto the table. "Played a little trick on them. That's all. Locked the door to give them a scare. How was I to know the storm would be that bad? Besides, looks like they kept each other warm enough." The men laughed. A low, ugly sound. "They say she came back looking like a wild woman." Jeb Higgins snickered. "Ruined, for sure." "So, she was ruined long before this," Caleb sneered. "I just proved it. Within an hour, a boy brought a note to the hotel. It was a summons. A special meeting of the church elders had been called for 4 o'clock. The note said it was to discuss the moral standing of certain members of the community. It was a trial. Emma sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the wall. She had washed the mud from her face and hair, put on her dry dress, the plain gray wool she always wore. She felt hollowed out by grief. "You don't have to go," Luke said. He was pacing the room, his shoulder bandaged where he had cut it on the ice, his presence filling the small space. "Yes," Emma said, her voice dead. "I do. If I don't go, they win. They write the end of the story." "I'm going with you," Luke said. "They won't like that." "I don't care what they like." At 4 o'clock, the church was full. It seemed the entire town had squeezed into the pews. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and self-righteousness. When Luke and Emma walked in, the silence was absolute.
Emma walked with her head high, though her hands were trembling at her sides. Luke walked beside her, not touching her now, but close enough to be a shield. They stood at the front, before the altar rail. The Reverend Thomas stood behind the pulpit, looking down his nose. To the side, sitting in the front pew with his arms crossed, was Caleb Moore. He looked smug, untouched, victorious. "Emma Hale," the Reverend began, his voice echoing in the rafters. "We have called this meeting to address a grave scandal. You have been absent from this community for months. You returned today in the company of Mr. Carver, having spent the winter alone with him in a remote cabin." "We were trapped," Emma said clearly. "So you say," the Reverend replied smoothly. "But the Bible tells us to avoid the very appearance of evil. And this is more than an appearance. Your mother passed without you. The town is in an uproar. We must ask, what happened in that cabin?" "We survived," Luke cut in, his voice deep and carrying to the back of the room. "We survived starvation. We survived freezing. No thanks to this town. Mr. Carver," the Reverend warned, "you are not a member of this flock." "No," Luke said. "I'm just the man who watched you all let a woman be destroyed because it entertained you." Caleb stood up then, hooking his thumbs in his belt. He turned to face the crowd, playing to his audience. "Now, Reverend," Caleb said, his voice oozing mock sympathy, "let's be fair. Nature took its course. We all know Emma has appetites. She's been looking for a husband for years. Maybe she just found a way to trap a rich one." He turned to Luke with a smirk. "If you're a real man, Carver, you'll do the right thing. Marry her. Make an honest woman of her. God knows nobody else will want her now. She's used goods." A gasp rippled through the women. Emma flinched as if he had slapped her. Luke didn't move toward Caleb. He moved to the center of the aisle. He turned his back on the altar and faced the town. "You want the truth?" Luke asked. "Here it is." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the square-cut nail. He held it up. "We didn't get stuck. We were nailed in." He pointed a shaking finger at Caleb. "That man, Caleb Moore, rode up to Serpent Ridge. He and his friends boarded the door from the outside while the blizzard was hitting. I found the boards. I found the nails. Blue iron, square cut, sold only at Miller's Hardware. And I found the boot prints under the snow." The crowd murmured. Heads turned toward Caleb. "He's lying," Caleb shouted, his face reddening. "He's trying to cover up his sin." "I'm telling you he tried to kill us," Luke roared, silencing the room. "He left us to die to settle a grudge. And you—" He swept his gaze over the elders. "You knew. You heard the rumors in the saloon. You knew he bragged about a trick. And you did nothing. You let a woman's reputation mean more than her life." He took a breath, his voice dropping to a steely calm. "I am not innocent," Luke said. "I came to this valley and I used my money to bleed you. I bought your debts. I foreclosed on your homes. I acted like my father, a man who thought land mattered more than people." He looked at Emma, then back at the crowd. "That ends today. I am forgiving the debts." Shocked silence. "The Miller farm," Luke said. "The haunting mortgage on the blacksmith shop, and the Hale ranch." He looked at the Reverend. "I am returning the deeds. I don't want to build a kingdom on your misery anymore." "You can't buy your way out of hell," Caleb screamed, stepping into the aisle. He sensed the mood shifting. The townspeople were looking at Luke with wide eyes, hope warring with prejudice. Caleb was losing them. "He's doing this because he got caught," Caleb yelled. "Desperate. He's buying you off. And her? She's a whore. She's been a whore since she tried to seduce me 5 years ago. She begged me for it. She—" "Liar!" The scream came from Emma. She stepped forward, her plain dress swirling around her. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was burning. "I never begged you," she shouted, her voice ringing off the stone walls. "You came to my house. You forced your way in. You pinned me against the wall and tried to lift my skirts." The church went deathly still. "I fought you," Emma said, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady.
I hit you with a piece of firewood. That's how you got that scar on your cheek. It wasn't an accident. It was me defending my honor." She turned to the women in the pews. "I went to the sheriff. I went to the reverend. They told me to be quiet. They said it would ruin me. So I took the silence. I took the name Old Maid rather than marry a monster." She pointed at Caleb. "I would rather live alone in a cave for 1,000 years than let that man touch me again." The truth rang in the air, undeniable and raw. "She's crazy!" Caleb yelled, his eyes wild. He looked around for support, but the men were looking at their boots, and the women were looking at Emma with dawning horror and recognition. "Shut your mouth. More." The blacksmith stood up. "No!" Caleb snapped. He reached into his coat. "He's got a gun!" someone screamed. Panic erupted. People dove for the pews. Caleb pulled a revolver, leveling it at Emma, his face twisted in a mask of hate. "You ruin everything!" Caleb shrieked. Luke moved. He didn't go for a weapon. He threw himself across the space between them, shoving Emma hard to the floor. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Luke jerked back, spinning around, and fell heavily against the pew. Emma screamed, scrambling on the floor. "Luke!" Before Caleb could fire again, the blacksmith and 3 other men tackled him. The gun skittered across the floor. Caleb was pinned, shouting obscenities, his nose bloody from the impact. The sheriff, who had been standing near the back, finally pushed through the chaos. He grabbed Caleb by the collar, hauling him up. "That's enough, Caleb," the sheriff said, his voice grim. There was no looking the other way this time, not in front of everyone, not after the shot. Emma crawled to Luke. He was sitting slumped against the wood, clutching his left shoulder. Blood was seeping rapidly between his fingers, staining his coat dark red. "Luke!" She pressed her hands over his, trying to staunch the flow. "Oh God, you're shot!" "I'm all right," Luke gritted out, his face pale. "Just grazed the bone. I think—" The church fell silent again, save for the sound of Caleb being dragged out in irons. The townspeople stood up, looking at the scene before the altar. They saw the rich cattleman, bleeding on the floor. They saw the old maid, her hands covered in his blood, weeping over him. They saw the way he looked at her, not with shame, but with a fierce, protective devotion. "Why?" Emma sobbed, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. "Why did you do that?" Luke looked up at her, his eyes hazy with pain but clear with intent. He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek, leaving a smear of blood on her skin, a mark not of violence, but of sacrifice. "I told you," he whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "I won't let anyone hurt you, not ever again." Emma bowed her head against his chest, and for the first time in the history of Bitter Creek, no one said a word against her. The judgment had died with the gunshot. All that was left was the truth, bleeding out on the floor. The silence that settled over Bitter Creek in the days following the shooting was not the empty silence of the winter plains, but a heavy, contemplative quiet. It was the silence of a town that had looked into a mirror and flinched at its own reflection. Caleb Moore sat in the single iron-barred cell at the back of the sheriff's office, awaiting the circuit judge who would arrive with the spring thaw, the swagger that had carried him through life, buoyed by his uncle's badge and his family's money, had evaporated the moment the handcuffs clicked shut in front of the congregation. His friends, the men who had laughed with him in the saloon, who had helped him nail the boards to the cabin door, now walked with their heads low, crossing the street to avoid Luke Carver's gaze. In the small room at the boarding house, the air smelled of arnica and clean linen. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her hands moving deftly as she unwrapped the bandages from Luke's shoulder. The bullet had plowed a furrow through the muscle of his upper arm, grazing the bone but missing the artery. It was an angry, ugly wound, stitched with black silk thread by the doctor who had finally found his courage once the balance of power shifted. "You flinched," Emma murmured, pausing with the fresh linen strip in her hand. "It stings," Luke grunted,
staring resolutely at the wallpaper to keep from looking at the curve of her neck.
"If you would sit still, it would hurt less,"
she scolded gently, dipping a cloth into a bowl of warm water to clean the edges of the cut.
"I've been sitting still for 3 days,"
Luke complained, though there was no real heat in his voice. "I have cattle to move. I have fences to check."
"You have a hole in your arm. Luke Carver,"
Emma said, applying the salve. "The cattle will wait. The fences will stand. If you tear these stitches, I am not sewing you up again. You're a hard woman, Emma Hale." He teased softly.
"I had to be,"
she replied, tying off the bandage with a neat, secure knot. She rested her hand on his uninjured shoulder for a moment, a lingering touch that spoke volumes. "To survive the winter," Luke reached up and covered her hand with his own. The banter died away, replaced by the thick, warm intimacy that had followed them down from the mountain. They didn't need to speak to understand each other anymore. The shared terror and salvation of the church floor hung between them, a bond stronger than blood.
"Thank you," he whispered. "For the bandage? For everything?"
Luke's recovery was swift, driven by a restless energy to set things right. As soon as he could wear a coat without grimacing, he marched to the bank. Mr. Sterling, the banker, looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man facing a firing squad. But Luke didn't shout. He sat down and laid a piece of paper on the desk. "We are restructuring," Luke said, his voice flat and brook no nonsense. "The foreclosure on the Miller place is canceled. Convert it to a 5-year lease with an option to buy back at the original principal. No interest for the first year," Sterling stammered, wiping sweat from his bald pate.
"But, Mr. Carver, the loss of revenue."
"I have enough revenue," Luke said. "I don't need to eat my neighbors to stay fat. And the blacksmith's note? Tear it up. He tackled the man who shot me. Consider it payment for services rendered." News of the Great Forgiveness, as the saloon patrons dubbed it, spread through the valley like wildfire. Families who had been packing their wagons, preparing to drift west in shame, unpacked their trunks. Men who had cursed Luke's name now tipped their hats with genuine respect when he walked past. It wasn't a complete absolution. Luke was still a businessman, and he expected hard work, but the predatory cruelty that had defined the Carver legacy was gone. In its place was a hard but fair hand. For Emma, the spring brought a different kind of reckoning. The snow had melted enough to clear the road to the cemetery on the hill, a windswept patch of ground fenced with rough cedar posts. She went there every afternoon, wrapping her shawl tight against the lingering chill. The mound of earth over her mother's grave was raw and muddy, marked only by a simple wooden cross.
"I'm sorry, Mama,"
Emma whispered to the damp earth, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood.
"I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I tried. I promise you, I tried."
She told the grave about the cabin. She spoke of the hunger, the cold, and the terrifying moment the door wouldn't open. She spoke of Luke, how he had annoyed her, how he had saved her, how he had stood in front of a bullet for her. "He sees me, Mama," she confessed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "He doesn't see the old maid. He doesn't see a scandal. He just sees Emma. I think you would have liked him, even if he is a stubborn cowboy." One afternoon, the crunch of boots on gravel made her turn. Luke was standing at the gate, hat in hand. He looked hesitant, unsure if he was intruding on her grief. Emma didn't send him away. She extended a hand. Luke walked to her side and knelt in the mud, heedless of his good trousers. He stared at the cross for a long moment. "Mrs. Hale," Luke said, his voice deep and solemn in the quiet air. "I never had the honor of meeting you, but I know you. I know you because I know your daughter." Emma stifled a sob, pressing her hand to her mouth. "You raised a woman of iron and grace." Luke continued, speaking to the ground as if Sarah Hale were sitting right there in her parlor. "She survived a winter that would have killed a lesser man. She kept me alive when I didn't deserve it, and she stood up in a room full of cowards and spoke the truth." He reached out and touched the earth gently. "You rest easy, ma'am. I'll look out for her now." I promise you, as long as I have breath, she will never be alone again." Emma broke down then, not the jagged, tearing grief of guilt, but the softer, healing weeping of being released. Luke stood and gathered her into his good arm, letting her cry into his coat until the shadows stretched long across the valley. The town began to thaw along with the ground. It was slow, and it was awkward. Women who had crossed the street to avoid Emma now stopped to ask about her health, their eyes darting away nervously before offering small jars of jam or loaves of bread as clumsy peace offerings. Emma accepted them with quiet dignity. She knew they couldn't erase the years of exclusion, but she also knew that hate was too heavy a burden to carry into the spring. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and violet, Luke arrived at the boarding house. He wasn't wearing his work clothes. He was wearing his Sunday best, his boots polished to a shine. "Walk with me," he said. They walked out of town, past the last few shacks, onto the trail that wound up toward the foothills. The air smelled of wet earth, sagebrush, and the sweet, impossible scent of new grass. The creek roared in the distance, swollen with meltwater, but the violence of the flood had passed. Luke stopped near a grove of aspen trees, their white bark glowing in the twilight. He turned to face her. "I'm not good at speeches." "Emma," he began, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "I deal in contracts and cattle. But there's something I need to say." Emma watched him, her heart beginning to hammer a rhythm against her ribs. "This winter," Luke said, looking at the distant peaks, "it stripped everything away. The money, the pride, the lies we tell ourselves. It left us bare. And what I saw in you, it was the best thing I've ever seen." He looked her in the eye. "I love you, Emma. Not because I feel guilty about your land. Not because I feel responsible for your reputation. I love you because you are stubborn, because you are kind when the world gives you no reason to be, because you are fierce." He took a step closer. "I want to build a life with you. Not just live in the same house, but build something. I want to combine the Triple C with the Hale land. I want us to be partners, equals." He took a breath, his voice trembling slightly. "I want you to be my wife, but only if it's what you choose. Not because the town expects it, not because Caleb dared me, but because you want to be there." Emma stood frozen. The words washed over her, warm and terrifying. Old Maid. The label had been her armor and her cage for so long. The idea of stepping out of it, of binding herself to a man as powerful as Luke Carver, paralyzed her. "Luke," she whispered, I'm scared. You're a rich man. I'm just a seamstress with a ruined name. What if one day you wake up and regret it? What if you see me the way they used to?" Luke didn't try to hush her. He didn't dismiss her fear. He just looked at her with a steady, patient gaze. "Then say no," he said gently. "If you say no, Emma, I will still give you your land back. I will still make sure you have everything you need. You don't have to marry me to be safe. You are free." The humility of it, the absolute lack of coercion, shattered the last wall around her heart. He wasn't trying to own her. He was offering her a key. A shaky laugh bubbled up in her throat, followed by tears. "You foolish cowboy," she choked out. "Everyone warned me about you. They said you were a devil, and here you are, the only honest man in the territory." She stepped forward and took his face in her hands. "Yes, I choose you. I choose us." Luke let out a breath that seemed to empty his lungs of a lifetime of loneliness. He kissed her then, deeply, lingeringly, in the cool spring air. It wasn't a kiss of desperation like the one in the cabin. It was a kiss of promise, sealing a pact between two souls who had walked through the fire and come out tempered like steel. The wedding was small. It was held in the church, but it felt different this time. The sunlight streamed through the clean glass. The blacksmith stood as Luke's witness, Mrs. Gable, looking properly chastened and surprisingly tearful. Stood with Emma, the Reverend, his voice lacking its usual thunder. Spoke of grace. He spoke of the seasons, and how winter gives way to life. When Luke and Emma exchanged vows, they spoke quietly, for each other alone. "With this ring," Luke said, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger, "I give you my name, my honor, and my heart." "With this ring," Emma replied, her voice steady, "I give you my trust, my hope, and my home." 2 days later, they saddled the horses. They packed not for survival, but for a homecoming. They rode up the winding trail toward Serpent Ridge, leaving the town and its whispers behind. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. The valley floor was a riot of color: purple lupine, yellow balsam root, and the delicate white stars of phlox pushing up through the damp soil. When they reached the cabin, it looked small against the vast backdrop of the mountains. The roof was patched where the tree had hit. The door, now repaired and hanging straight, stood waiting. Emma dismounted and walked to the porch. She ran her hand over the rough logs. It still bore the scars of the nails, the splintered wood where Luke had tried to pry them free. "It looks different," she said. "It's just wood and stone," Luke said, coming up beside her. "We make it what it is." They went inside. The air was stale, but it didn't smell of fear anymore. It smelled of pine and memories. They spent the afternoon cleaning, sweeping out the dust, scrubbing the table, airing out the blankets in the bright sun. They laughed as they worked, remembering the arguments over the coffee, the tension over the firewood. The horror had been leached out, leaving only the bond of survival. When the sun began to dip low, casting long purple shadows across the floor, Luke went to his saddlebag. He pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box and placed it on the shelf above the fireplace. "Open it," he said. Emma lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of papers. On top was a deed, the Hale parcel, transferred to Emma Carver, sole owner. She touched the paper with trembling fingers. It wasn't just land. It was her father's sweat. It was her mother's garden. It was her history. Returned to her. "It belongs to you," Luke said softly. "It always did. I just held it for a while." Emma turned to him, clutching the box to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me back my past. And for the future," Luke said, pulling her into his arms. "I was thinking we could add a room to the south side for a nursery. The light is good there." Emma smiled, a radiant, full expression that transformed her plain face into something beautiful. "A nursery? You're planning ahead, Mr. Carver." "I'm a rancher," he grinned, kissing her forehead. "We always plan for the next season. Maybe we'll hear little feet running on these floors someday. God willing." "God willing," Emma agreed. Night fell, vast and starry. The mountains became a jagged black silhouette against a sky dusted with diamonds. Inside the cabin, they lit a fire. It wasn't a desperate defense against the freezing dark this time. It was a hearth fire, warm and golden. They lay together in the narrow bunk, arms wrapped around each other. The desire was there, hot and urgent, a reminder that they were alive. But beneath it was a profound, abiding tenderness. Emma traced the scar on Luke's shoulder with her fingertips, feeling the ridge of healed skin. She didn't flinch when he kissed her scars, the invisible ones she carried. She felt safe. For the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly safe. Luke held her, listening to her breathing sync with his. He looked at her sleeping face in the firelight and knew, with the certainty of a man who knows the land, that she was the best thing he had ever found. She was the gold in the rock. She was the water in the desert. At dawn, they stepped out onto the small porch. The sun was cresting the eastern ridge, spilling liquid gold across the high plains. The air was crisp and smelled of pine resin and damp earth. The world below them was waking up, harsh, unforgiving, and impossibly beautiful. Luke wrapped his arm around Emma's shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned into him, resting her head on his chest. They stood there, watching the light chase the shadows from the valley floor. They were the rich cowboy and the old maid no longer. They were Luke and Emma. They had walked through the winter, through the hatred, and through the fire. and they had come out the other side, against the vast, indifferent silence of the West. They stood together, proof that even in the hardest soil, love could put down roots deep enough to weather any storm. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Luke and Emma through the winter snows of Bitter Creek. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your city or country. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the American frontier. I invite you to share your thoughts on the story in English in the comments section. Did Luke redeem himself? Was Emma's bravery inspiring? I look forward to reading your views.